Good afternoon, everyone. Let me welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm Steve McDonald. I'm the director of the Project on Leadership and Building State Capacity here, and also the director of the Africa program. We're very, very happy to see you here. I think we still have a few stragglers coming in, but we need to get started. First of all, let me welcome you to the center, which, of course, as you know, is the official monument to President Woodrow Wilson, established in 1968 by Congress as a place where the Wilsonian ideal of bringing together the worlds of policy and the world of ideas tries to be played out. We're really happy to be able to host this event today, not least because it has several people with whom we've worked very closely on the panel, several people we've worked very closely with over the years. This is sponsored by the Leadership Project, as I said, which seeks to promote more sustainable approaches in international conflict prevention and post-conflict reconstruction. And today's event speaks directly to our methodology of inclusion of a broad group of stakeholders for political processes and negotiations, especially in fragile states and divided societies, where political interests are often very narrowly defined. I'm going to play just the role of your host, and in that context, I will establish a few ground rules. As you know, when we normally have a panel, we ask them to speak for 10, 12 minutes each, and then we try to leave the bulk of the time open for questions and answers. We will be moderated today by Michael Lund, who I'll introduce in just a moment, and he will introduce the other panelists. But when Michael recognizes you during the question and answer stage, please raise your hand and then wait for a microphone, because we are being webcast and we need to be able to hear your voice. So identify yourself when you get the microphone and then ask your question. Now, Michael has been working with us for a long time as consulting program manager for the Leadership Project, and he is also a senior associate for conflict and peacebuilding at Management Systems International. He's got a long history of research and writing with NGOs, and of course including the Woodrow Wilson Center, and is focused on sources of interstate conflict in fragile states and effective diplomatic development and military policies and strategies for preventing conflicts. So we're very, very happy to have Michael take over as our moderator for this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, and my own welcome to everybody for this really leading edge topic, the whole question of integrating civil society into peace processes at several stages. Today we're going to talk mainly about the peace negotiation stage, but at later stages, post-conflict, state building, and so on, it's also a rising subject. And I think there's sort of three reasons why it's very fitting for us to host this meeting, although I'm sure others could do it too, which I'd just like to point out to sort of lead a little bit into some of the issues that I think we'll get into. One is that we've had a series of events on the theme of what really works in state building and conflict prevention. And the reason for that kind of pretentious title is that we're trying to get away from simply advocacy approaches to this extremely urgent and important subject of how does one prevent fragile and failed states from deteriorating, and how does one rebuild them, help to facilitate the process of rebuilding once they've fallen into some major war or crisis. And we've had a series of a few other meetings, the brochures from which are out on the table. The second reason that there's a connection between this topic and what we've been doing, which I'll probably hope to follow up with in maybe my own questions, is that we've got a volume coming out on which Howard Wolpe and I, with Steve's input as well, looked at 6 cases whereby initiatives commonly called conflict transformation workshops were taken in countries like Burundi, where Howard's work and the project's work is still being carried on, but also Cyprus, Estonia, Sri Lanka, Guyana, and Tajikistan. This kind of mid-level or track 2 and 1.5 or track 2 initiative has been taken, and the point of that is to evaluate the effects that they've actually had on their conflict environment. That volume should be coming out in the next 6 months or so. We're coming close to the end of doing the analysis. And the third reason is the theme of the year, so to speak, in Washington is integrated strategies, comprehensive approaches to peace building, again, both at any stage of a conflict. And the question, I think, at hand with regard to that theme, it comes under different rubrics, the 3 Ds, whole of government approaches, whole of community approaches, multilateral cooperation, collaboration. The theme of that is that more multifaceted, multi-pronged strategies, holistic strategies have to be carried out within these contexts in order for what everybody wants to occur, that is sustainable peace, to actually materialize. And it seems to me that if there's a danger of this becoming another buzzword, unless the content of that theme is filled in, what do we really mean by holistic strategies? It can't mean everybody doing their own thing, joining the bandwagon in some kind of random come one, come all approach. It means pulling together the most effective initiatives and activities at different levels in different sectors pertinent to a given stage in the evolution of a country's history and travail. So those are the sorts of analytical questions which we're trying to make some headway in answering. And to help us do that, we have some very experienced and knowledgeable people, which I think who will enlighten us in very interesting detail to discuss the results, the findings of a volume which I'll let Anthony describe further. So let me introduce everybody briefly, not as elaborately as Steve decided to do with regard to me. I'm a little embarrassed about that. But you have the information about them in the bio sheets, so please take a look to see how much depth we've got represented here at the front head. So let me turn this over to Anthony Juanes St. John, first of all, who's an assistant professor of the International Peace and Conflict Resolution Program here in Washington at American University. And then have Elizabeth McClintock, who works closely with our program in various countries, particularly Burundi, who is the managing partner at CM Partners, and has, as you can see, a long degree of experience in doing conflict resolution training, facilitation, and is doing some analytical work, finishing her dissertation at Fletcher, I believe, right? To, I guess, do more reflection on your years of experience. And then we'll turn to Carla Coppel, who is the director of the Initiative for Inclusive Security, who will bring us a related but somewhat specific dimension to the subject. So let me turn it over to Anthony. We'll have about 15 minutes for each person, and then we'll open it up for general discussion and questions.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Steve. It's an honor to be here at the Wilson Center. The reason that I got into this topic of civil society and inclusion in peace processes is because for a long time I'd been deeply interested in the topic of exclusion, of secret negotiations, which are all about keeping as many people in the dark about what you're negotiating on as possible. And there are a number of really interesting historical and sort of contemporary cases of secrecy in negotiation out there. Secrecy has come back into vogue after being the way in which diplomacy was conducted for a long time. The whole issue of secrecy seemed to me the other side of the coin of inclusion, and secret negotiations seemed to me to offer some advantages, but over time some particular disadvantages. And thus it became important for me to look at why one would want to exclude people from a peace negotiation and what the impact of that is. That led me to thinking about about what we should do about broadening the scope of peace negotiations, why people want to keep them small in the first place, and what happens if we bring people in and broaden them. So there's a long tradition, I think, of elite-driven, elite-focused negotiations where the emphasis of the international community, of outside interveners, of third-party mediators, of the parties themselves, is to simply bring armed groups to the table and nobody else. And there are some really important reasons for that I think we need to take into consideration if we want to understand what it is and try to propose some alternatives to it. But I think the general rule of international mediators has been essentially, let's find the minimum number of people needed to get agreement who can also then command the broadest possible support once agreement is reached. And that simple rule, I think, has proven to be rather insufficient for transforming a number of cases over the last 15, 20 years from violent conflict to a more sustainable, sustained peace. So hence, this has led to some research that I've conducted, in particular a project that I undertook with my colleague Darren Q, who's here. This led to a longer project that is still ongoing. We've published some of the findings in a journal issue that came out in the middle of last year. The journal is International Negotiation, volume 13, I think number 1. Was where we published a number of cases and some initial findings of our look at what happens when you try to broaden the spectrum of who gets to the table and why you would do that. So I think in opposition to this focus on elite-driven secret negotiations where only the top-level leaders know who's going to the table, or more interesting still, they have people going to a negotiation table, everybody knows about it, but secretly they send different people quietly to negotiate with their counterparts. There is, I think, an emerging norm of inclusivity that I think is important to take note of and to do in a careful and planned and strategic way, not simply to do because it's the right thing to do. And I do believe it's the right thing to do. But certainly, as Michael mentioned, there has been, I think, general consensus emerging in our community on the need for inclusivity in the peace building, in the post-conflict phase. What's interesting to note, though, is that civil society is not content only with that. And increasingly groups around the world in conflict are saying we would like to influence the people at the table while they are negotiating the terms of conclusion of a conflict. Sometimes they're not content to stay at that level. They want to be at the table themselves, and they are increasingly vocal about trying to find ways to do that. So this is a phenomenon that I think is emerging, that's ongoing, that I just have noticed. Other people have noticed it too. It's worth looking at in detail, analyzing in detail. I think in the end, what I'd like to see happen with our research, I'm not a person who just likes to generate theories for the purpose of generating theories. I care about the success of peace processes. And I think the people who design peace processes or who get involved in them, and I'd like to count myself as one of them, would be careful in how we structure, how we build up a peace process, how we design it in the architectural sense of the word, in terms of thinking about how and when we decide to include people, when it's appropriate to narrow the spectrum, when it's appropriate to broaden it, and to do so cognizant of the fact that there will be consequences for those choices. Let me speak briefly what I think are some of the general advantages and dangers of both exclusion and inclusion generally. And I think my colleagues will have more to say about these things specifically. But certainly elites have wanted to negotiate in behind closed doors, if you will, in secret, partly because that is efficient. And if you are like me and you've had some experience mediating conflicts among different parties, you know that there is a point at which you'd like to reduce the noise in the room and get people who can say yes, and exclude those who are there only to make noise but who can't really say yes to anything. My time spent in labor management negotiation in the United States taught me that there are moments when you really need a very quiet meeting between the heads of delegations and nobody else if possible. In fact, you don't even want the delegations to know that their heads are meeting with each other at some point. So there is a certain efficiency because communication happens directly at that point, and because there is the absence of an audience, there is the possibility of negotiators being more forthcoming with each other on where their real priorities and interests are. That, in the hands of a skilled intervener, can be the grist for getting optimal or optimized agreements. Okay, all of this is theoretical, but I've seen it put in practice as well. So there's some neatness to this. There's the possibility of some non-committal brainstorming that can happen because there isn't an audience before which the negotiator needs to posture. Those are the people who should be the decision makers as well, or very close to them. So this efficiency issue is, I think, very important. There are, of course, a number of dangers of being too exclusive. Certainly, those who are most impacted by the negotiations, or to be more precise, those who have been most impacted by a conflict, if there's a degree of exclusion, they are not going to be heard, and there will not be a direct channel for them to have their concerns met or at least addressed. I think there's a built-in danger of this, especially in the so-called civil wars of the last 15, 20 years, that the spoils of the peace go then to the armed groups who are probably the least deserving of the spoils in the peace. In other words, they then take the power, they take the offices in government, if there's power sharing, they take the resources of the state as they begin to get into power, etc. They gain legitimacy in ways that sometimes I'm not sure they always deserve. And that must be grating, at the very least, to those who have been the victims of their violence. Most importantly, one of the dangers that I think has been overlooked over time is the spotty implementation that takes place when people are excluded in a broad way. Now, I'm not at this point advocating that you need full inclusion from the beginning of a negotiation. I recognize the advantages of quiet times where negotiators can really put their heads together. However, implementation of peace agreements increasingly means more than charismatic, demagogic leaders coming together and saying, this is the way to go, everybody will follow me. They just don't do it. People are increasingly able to get arms, to mobilize themselves. Conflict entrepreneurs and others are able to mobilize parts of the population against peace very quickly, relatively easily, and in very fluid ways. So poor implementation is, I think, a characteristic of exclusion. Certainly you see systematic problems like parties signing agreements and then factions breaking away saying we don't adhere to this ceasefire, it doesn't serve us, we will continue fighting, etc. Inclusion, on the other hand, also has its advantages and disadvantages, and they are sort of the opposite side of the coin here. The advantages of more inclusive processes are that you are potentially laying the seeds of societal buy-in. If there is an agreement, more people will have a say in its crafting and therefore will have a stake in its implementing. There could be much more engagement from society in general. There is probably a better range of perspectives that are included. The people who needed to be heard may be able to negotiate terms that serve their constituencies well and meet their needs in material ways that have a line item, a resource, a dollar figure or a euro figure after that item. That leads me to think that there's a better possibility of some vertical integration of a peace process. People from the top to the middle to the bottom will be they will be, if you will, aligned on the direction that the case is taking. There are dangers of inclusion as well, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. This is just some reflections on our research and practice. Inclusivity means noise, probably. It means having a lot of people in the room who, some of whom need to be there, some of whom really want to be there but don't need to be there, and some of whom probably shouldn't be there, frankly, but who have gotten their way in and can make things difficult for negotiators. There has always been knowledge in the negotiation world that when you negotiate in front of a larger group of people, your audience, your constituencies, you tend to become more positional, more rigid, and you may do things that hurt your own side because of that rigidity and positionality that I think reaches its extremes when the spectrum is too broad and when there are too many people watching what's going on. So there can be some material interference as well as just simply the presence of audiences. Ultimately, this is knowledge I want to be in the service of what I mentioned as vertical integration, somehow having the grass tops and the grassroots be in alignment over what their engagement is in a societal change as momentous as the transition from violence to peace. And some way for the elites and the international community to also focus on what the needs are of the people who are most impacted. I think there are plenty of cases where there has been so little engagement with the population at large over a transition to peace and no consultation. Or if there has been consultation, it's only been to reduce the negotiators' own scope of negotiation. In other words, to give themselves little room for concession. In other words, they are trying to get their populations more militant and riled up rather than more amenable to a possible accommodation with people with whom they've been fighting. So that means I think we need to focus on capacity building for people at the bottom, for the grassroots, as well as training and integration for people in the middle, perhaps the leadership level of civil society, to make sure that they know what to do, that they have the tools and concepts for reaching out to the elites who are supposedly negotiating in their name, and if not, to find their way into the room and equip them with the concepts, tools, terminology, and skills to do something differently once they're in that room. So that's a little bit of my observations. I don't know where I am in terms of time, Michael, but...
well, actually, you can take a few more minutes.
Okay,
if you want.
Just a couple of seconds then.
What a luxury.
Maybe two.
Two, all right. The last point I'd like to make at this moment is to talk about some of the varieties of the forms of participation that civil society can undertake. Again, in very general terms that some people in this room actually can flesh out in their case knowledge. Certainly, civil society groups, whether at the bottom or the middle level of leadership, I think can organize themselves to put pressure on elite delegations from which they are systematically excluded and make sure that their agenda items are addressed and begin to exercise some forms of accountability. Let people know that they are being watched and that they will be held accountable for their results, which is part of good governance and democracy. Also, finding their ways to get a seat at the table in terms of being members of delegations. Now, I've seen examples of this where it seemed to be, little more than tokenism. On the other hand, I think we're beginning to see more examples of this where it is real participation. Civil society members are consulted, are brought in, are asked to assist and participate, and their participation is valued for what it is. Sometimes we have seen parallel processes where civil society groups are asked to come up with blueprints, with plans, with documents, and are made to feel part of the process in a way that keeps them out of the main negotiation rooms, in exchange for the promise that what they're doing will be integrated, will be put on the tables and the notepads of the elite negotiators. And those are several of the different forms that we've seen. All of them, I think, have manifested themselves successfully and unsuccessfully in different places for different reasons and are worthy of further inquiry. So let me end my comments there and pass the mic over.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Liz?
Okay. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be back at the Wilson Center. What I think I'll do is pick up on one particular point that Anthony made and then perhaps talk a bit about the case that I'm most familiar with based on my work in Burundi. So both Michael and Anthony made reference to I think you said that's the theme in Washington, Michael, the integrated strategies, as it were, trying to get the whole of government or the whole of community involved in, yes, the negotiation of peace accords, but I think more importantly, the implementation of the accords, because the two are linked, and as Anthony said, poor implementation seems to be a characteristic of exclusionary processes. And that is where the inclusion of civil society, I think, remains so important. Because without the community, there is very little traction in the implementation process, I think, in a post-conflict state. So clearly there's widespread acknowledgement that we need to do better on securing the peace. There are lots of activities that go into that, everything from DDR processes to SSR processes, economic development, sort of reconciliation, and that can manifest itself as a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, transitional justice, etc. So that leads to a lot of questions, most of which we won't address today, but, sort of which are the activities that we absolutely need to do in order to secure the peace? When do we do them? Sort of the priority and timing of those activities. But perhaps what is most of interest to us today is who does those things? And clearly we have a sense that the United Nations is involved, third parties, regional actors, the government itself, and civil society. And I think one thing we haven't really talked about here is, well, what does that mean? How do we define civil society? Who exactly is that? And I think in each country that's incredibly context specific, depending on the history of that particular country, what the definition of those associations. Are we talking about, well, we are talking about everything from trade unions to church groups to Boy Scouts and Girl Guides and NGOs. That can be conflict resolution NGOs, advocacy groups, all those things. And depending, I think, on the history of the country, how people choose to get involved in what we call civil society matters. Because then when you ask those groups later on to implement a peace accord, you're giving resources to organizations that may or may not have real contact with folks on the ground. One of the questions that arose, I will say, in the Burundi process was, did civil society, as it was constituted at the time, simply replicate the very dynamics that were found in the conflict itself? So therefore, if you're engaging civil society, both in the design of the peace process and its implementation, are you actually reinforcing some of the very conflict dynamics that you're trying to get past, or deal with, rather? So I think it's important. I think my work has led me to say yes to inclusion, and probably generally the earlier the better. But exactly when and how that happens is still a rather thorny question. I think, I'll say it depends, and everybody will raise their eyebrows. Of course it depends. Depends on the conflict. It depends on the nature of civil society. A couple of the challenges that were evoked sort of in the case of the peace process in Burundi was certainly, again, that civil society replicated the very conflict dynamics that the peace process was meant to address, and it was not particularly representative of society. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the case of Burundi, it was a over 13-year civil war. And the reason I feel like today I'm being somewhat imprecise is for all of us who work in the conflict resolution field or in post-conflict state building, peace building, and you can all define those terms as you choose, that often, despite the fact that you might have a peace accord, a lot of violence continues. And in the case of Burundi, in fact, the peace accord was signed in 2000, but the ceasefire agreement with the major rebel group was not signed until the end of 2002 and actually had to be renegotiated and signed again in the end of 2003. So therefore, it's a bit fluid when you say, sort of when exactly are we ending the conflict. I'm not sure that we always know what that date actually is. So anyway, it was characterized as an ethnic conflict, really about access to power, access to the resources of the state. The mediation process started in the mid-1990s, and it was the regional heads of state that nominated Julius Nyerere, the then president of Tanzania, to lead the mediation effort. But it didn't really get going until 1998. At that time, just making a quick reference to Anthony's earlier work on sort of exclusionary processes, there was a secret negotiation led by the community of Sant'Egidio that occurred between the government of Burundi and the main rebel group, the CNDD. Interestingly, that was not particularly effectively integrated into the public peace process that was taking place, and so the gains made in the secret process were not as effective as they might have been due to the lack of integration. But a very interesting part of the Burundi process was there was provision made for a parallel process for civil society. But what didn't happen, and I think many actors who participated in some of the meetings that also took place in Arusha, was that there was no way to get those ideas really into the official process. And one main reason for that was that the Hutu groups, both political and armed groups, really resisted the inclusion of civil society in the peace process in Arusha. Why? Because of the two things I mentioned earlier. One, that civil society was seen to simply replicate the actual conflict dynamics and was seen to be populated by only elite Tutsi who were effectively trying to come in. If they weren't coming in the front door to the negotiation process, they were coming in through the window, as a friend of mine likes to put it. So there was great resistance to that because it was felt that already the Tutsi had more representation, if you will, at the table than they should have had, given the percentage of Tutsi in the country. And they felt like it was not going to be a fair process if those views were included. So a parallel process was envisaged, and there wasn't a good way to develop that process such that the civil society representatives were truly representative of society, and secondly, a lot of resistance because it replicated conflict dynamics. So what I sort of am left with I'm still continuing my work in Burundi. The character of civil society has changed greatly, opened up many more organizations, much more reflective of the population as a whole, which then leads back to implementation. And I think there are some successes with the implementation process, which then leads to a whole other set of questions, though, for me, which is, and again, they're linked. If you're going to include civil society, who exactly are you talking about? But then even in the implementation phase, a lot of resources, money, time, technical assistance, goes to local civil society organizations during an implementation process, bypassing often government. So then you ask yourself, are we actually doing both the peace process and civil society a disservice by effectively not doing the work that needs to be done to strengthen the state in which civil society would like to be introducing its ideas, to whom civil society is advocating for the interests of the members of the community? So it again raises a whole other set of questions for me as to what are the criteria for choosing whom you're going to work with, and then once you've chosen them, what kinds of resources do you choose to put into the support of civil society versus, for example, local government? Because if you continue to have a weak state, then we actually get further away from, I think, some of the work that Michael's doing, which is conflict prevention. How do you not recreate the very dynamics that led to conflict in the first place, which are often very strongly linked to weak states and a lack of governance or good governance. I think I've actually asked many more questions than answered, but I think that's probably normal at this stage of our research. I guess in conclusion, I'd just say two things. One is yes on inclusion. I think if you had to make a choice, then, and my Burundine colleague with whom I worked on the article for Anthony's for the journal that Anthony guest edited was yes, inclusion, and the earlier the better. Then there's a whole host of questions you have to ask yourself about who is it, how do you define the criteria for who that is, etc. And then secondly, what's critical to success is the implementation phase, and that of course requires the buy-in of the population. And who helps to create that buy-in? It's all these different civil society organizations. So there can't be a separation between the peace negotiations and the implementation phase. They're inextricably linked, and we have to think of better strategies to get civil society involved in a way that's representative of the society as a whole, and that will then increase our possibility for a truly, I think, sustainable peace.
Thank you. You can see how both the planner and the graduate student are coming through in those comments. So let's turn to Carla.
Thanks.
Your turn.
Thanks. Sorry. First of all, thanks to Michael and to Steve. It's a pleasure to be co-hosting this, and also Anthony, with both of your organizations and all of you as individuals. I come from a slightly different perspective. I direct an organization that at its heart is really an advocacy organization, that we work a lot on research and training in support of that advocacy. And our philosophy really is that more inclusive peace processes will serve the broader goals of peace. So we approach it from there, and really welcomed the research that was first encapsulated in the article that Anthony mentioned, because then we could say, see, we told you so. And that research really spoke to the fact that peace is more durable when it is more inclusive. And I would invite you all to read this study, because it's some of the first quantitative evidence really that does that analysis of different structures for peace building and says what are the implications for whether or not that peace endures. It dovetails additionally quite well with some research some of you may be familiar with out of the World Bank that looked at what point can you say that peace is going to stick. That doesn't mean that it's flourishing, that doesn't mean that everything is perfect, but it means that war is not going to return. And so I think that what you see gradually is the building of quite a compelling case for a more inclusive approach to peace. For me, fundamentally, the question is about at what point in a negotiating process, at what point in a peace-building process you turn from ending war towards building peace. And that at the end of the day, that is really the linchpin of what we're asking here when we hear from Elizabeth or Anthony and they're speaking about how soon you need to bring these processes, how soon you need to bring these other parties into the conversation. Because if you really want to build sustainable, durable peace, you're going to need other actors in society that are non-belligerents. And I started out saying that we are a group of advocates. And essentially what we say when we go into a room, and what we often hear is, well, it's very fragile, we need to only bring the parties with guns to the table, we really can't tip the table right now, we can't bring in these other voices, we can't create the noise. And yet the problem is that the peace process really encompasses much more than just putting down weapons. And so when you start to think about things related to power and wealth sharing, about reconstruction, about decision-making around governance structures, it's critical that you bring in those players, and yet often you go down a slippery slope and you make lots of decisions prior to bringing in the people who need to build the peace rather than ending the war. So, why am I here today? Well, I think that the complement that we provide in terms of our research is really perfect to the research and experience that's been laid out here today. We bring two publications that are brand new. It's the first place we're distributing them, that begin really to look at two issues. First, what is the evidence from concrete peace processes that begins to look at the role of women in civil society and how those more inclusive processes have worked and what the advantages and disadvantages of those have been. And they're here, and I'll talk a little bit about what's in them, but they feature 4 case studies. And the second is really about how you might create some models for creating greater inclusion that don't interfere necessarily with the core negotiating process, but do begin to bring voices to bear on that process, and that's this one. And it lays out 2 models that we've been involved in putting together, and both are available outside. And I'll speak to them because I think what they do really is perfectly complement the more macro level research that's been discussed thus far. So with that in mind, which examples did we look at? And we zeroed in on 4 examples because we thought they held promise. And I preface this by saying, as I did earlier, it doesn't mean that the perfect situation of peace has been achieved in these places. What we thought they offered were interesting mechanisms, interesting structures. And it's very difficult to get at these structures and to map them. And so I would say to you, even if you're not interested in the issue, for example, of bringing women into negotiations, what is very interesting, I think, in these publications is the map it presents for each negotiation and who was there and what role they played. And in the case of Guatemala, for example, what you're really talking about was a quite extensive process with 11 different civil society cadres set up under a civil society assembly that fed into the process. And in the case of Guatemala, what you were looking at was a peace process that had been going on and stalled and then was restarted with a broad civil society assembly. Originally, there were, I think, 6 civil society groups that eventually grew to 11 civil society groups. They did not have a seat at the table directly. They worked through the Archbishop and went into the negotiations through the head of the civil society assembly. But what you did see was a substantial voice. And in fact, there were not only quiet sideline negotiations between the heads of delegation, but there were also quiet sideline negotiations between individual delegations and representatives from the civil society assemblies. Because what it turned out was that you saw real added value being brought to the perspectives of the individual negotiating teams by the civil society groups that were brought into that conversation. One of those groups was women. And in this case, what you saw was a cadre that was dedicated to women's participation in the negotiations and bringing the voice of women as a separate group. But you also saw women in each of those 11 groups, and indeed women as members of the negotiating delegations at the table themselves, working together across the conflict line, so representing a range of different interests and representing different parties to the negotiation, and coming together and working to get their issues put on the table. And it was interesting because they raised a number of issues, and I'll turn to the next case because I don't want to spend too much time on the cases, and you can hear about the cases in the publication itself. But what was interesting was you began to see emerging in Guatemala the same things that you began to see emerging when you talked about Northern Ireland and the women's role in the peace process there, and similar things that started to emerge in Sri Lanka, and similar things that started to emerge around the Darfur peace agreement. So Northern Ireland, totally different process. And in fact, Northern Ireland is unique among the case examples we highlighted, because in that case, women actually, to get to the table, took advantage of an electoral process that was put in place to determine who would be at the table. So you had a participatory process with a popular vote, in which women, in this case, organized over a 6-week period to qualify themselves as a political party and run for space at the table. And the structure was set up, an interesting structure because obviously at that time Senator Mitchell was working in Northern Ireland. Interesting to see whether any of those reflections will now work around the Middle East. But a process in which an electoral process was used to ensure that you weren't creating an exclusionary system. Now, I doubt that Special Envoy Mitchell intended for women to get seats, but it worked, so we're happy with that. And they managed to, it was the only cross-conflict party that was created right? So you had Catholic and Protestant women coming together to form a political party, get the requisite number of signatures, and get enough votes to get 2 seats at the table, along with other parties. And you saw that what they did was they continued to be the only party working across the table to put their information into the agreement and to codify their proposals within the peace agreement that was subsequently signed. Sri Lanka, again, different case. You had external pressure creating a subcommittee for gender that involved representatives from Sri Lankan civil society selected by the government, along with female representatives of the Tamil Tigers at the time, coming to the table outside of the negotiation structure, creating their own terms of reference, drafting a document that would identify their priorities to feed back indirectly into the negotiating process. Of course, those negotiations fell apart, but what you saw was a structure created by the international mediator, in this case the Norwegians, that created space for women along with 3 other issues, they were called sort of issues, subcommittees, that were created as a sort of track 1.5 process to feed back into the formal table. And then we move to our 4th case, which is different, was the gender expert support team created around the margins of the 6th round of negotiations for the Darfur peace agreement. Again, a peace agreement that did not create durable peace, though it had 2 signatories, government and one of the movements that was at the table. But you had a group of 15 women brought in as neutral experts, so they represented no interest, to analyze, and this refers back to one of Anthony's examples, to analyze the protocols that were emerging from the negotiations, give their feedback into the parties, and use that as the lever for them to then insert their language into the agreement. In that case, it was convened, the Gender Expert Support Team, by the African Union as the mediators, with support from UN Development Fund for Women, UNIFEM, with pressure from some of the international observers. In this case, Canada was among the lead parties pushing for this kind of integration of women's perspectives. And what emerges from these 4 cases? That's a quick rundown on the 4 cases. Perhaps in the discussion we can speak to some other cases that aren't in the publication, but I wanted to focus on those. So what emerges? What difference did it make, apart from whether or not there was a return to violence? I would point to 4 things that relate both to the substance of what was in these agreements and also the process for getting to agreement, which I think might put some meat on the bones of what Anthony and the research is talking about when they say, why does this peace endure when more people are involved? Well, first of all, you saw critical issues coming into those agreements that otherwise often would have simply been forgotten. Okay? So we aren't talking about things that were points of contention. We're talking about things people wouldn't have been paying attention to in a peace agreement because they were less vested in those kinds of issues. So what am I talking about specifically? Issues like unified education. Right? The Northern Irish women said, no, we must have a unified education system if we're going to build a single society. In northern Uganda, just to bring in one other example, issues like halting sexual violence as part of a ceasefire. The issue of laying down guns is not all that matters when you're talking about halting violence in a time of conflict. Issues like wealth sharing and the need to protect the rights of women-headed households, where husbands have been killed and women are left heading households, in societies where women don't have land tenure rights. And it wasn't that anybody argued that these people had a need for these kinds of things in the peace agreement. It's that the belligerents, who are the only ones doing the talking, didn't think of it. Often, in many cases, when you dug down and looked at these agreements, what you saw was that, in fact, these points that were brought in by these women and civil society leaders were non-controversial. Nobody argued about them being put in. In fact, they said, oh, we didn't think of that. That's great. Please put that in. And in fact, that served the point of process, because what it did was it gave negotiators something they could agree on. When often there was nothing they could agree on, this they could agree on. And so it provided an entry point to a more constructive dialogue, which is something that anybody who's been involved in a mediation or negotiation knows is critically important to getting the ball rolling. If there are some things you can agree on, then clearly there are other things you can build on in creating a peace accord. So different things in terms of the substance, and those things in terms of the substance are fundamental to creating durable peace. So they made a difference. But also in terms of process. One thing we found time and time again when we talked to people who were involved in these negotiations was that they talked about women, particularly when women were neutral people representing the various different groups at the tables, greasing the wheel of the negotiations. They had solid relationships both with people who they could relate to across the table. They also had relationships with people in the parties whom they might represent. And so they created a bridge. They enabled dialogue to occur. They enabled conversation to occur outside the auspices of the formal structures. And so they created an atmosphere that was less belligerent. Second point, these women remained very, very vested in going back to their communities. Often the people who are at the negotiating tables are no longer staying within their communities. And frequently, even if they are based in their own communities, they have left to be at the negotiation for months and months and often for years. In many cases, when these women came in, even for brief periods of time, as well as other civil society representatives, they were coming from the front lines of conflict. They were representing a very different set of interests than people who had been divorced from that for months or even years. And so they came saying, how do I go back to my people? What do I say to them? How can I sell this agreement to them? How can I build ownership of this agreement for the long term? What kind of cycle of communication do I need to build back? And so they created the kind of stakeholder ownership that otherwise might well have been completely lacking had they not been there and not created that connection back home. So those, in some ways, I think, really highlight some of the ways in which we can see that if we bring these folks in at the right time, this is going to have dividends for the long term and pay off in terms of the reconstruction Elizabeth is talking about and in terms of the durable peace that Anthony referenced. So let me conclude by telling you a few of the lessons that we heard about how you do this. How can you create these structures in meaningful ways? And how do you make it work within that structure so that you're balancing the legitimate need to get belligerents to put down weapons with the equally legitimate need to build a path for durable and sustainable peace? And I would give you a few. First of all, the only way you're going to do it is if you create and cultivate the political will for the space to be created. And often that involves a choice. You have to choose whether you want these people to come in as part of the parties to that conflict. That is, do you want, if civil society is reflective of the parties to the conflict, do you want to say that straight up? We want civil society representatives who are representing Tutsi, representing Hutu, representing a cross-section? Or do you want to create a group of what you would call neutral experts, technical experts, who are coming with a third perspective to come into the room? There are pluses and minuses to each. They bring advantages and disadvantages. That's not to say that one is right or one is wrong. What's highlighted in the work that we do are many different models, and each model will have different pluses and minuses in different circumstances. Do you want to give them a direct role at the table? Do you want them to serve an adjunct role that feeds into the table? In either case, that political will be critical, because it does not make sense and does not have the kinds of benefits I'm talking about if there's not a connection back to the table, right? So you can't have people meeting for the sake of meeting out here when there's a discussion going on here and you're not creating those connections. So you do need to figure out how to create those connections in ways that are meaningful and that will bring to bear the substantive and process benefits that I've highlighted earlier. Then you need to introduce structures, whether formal or informal, for having those conversations. In times, we were looking at formal structures that have been created, but at times, informal structures have been created. We worked, for example, with the women on the margins of the Uganda negotiations, representing the Lord's Resistance Army, the government of Uganda, the civil society observers who were women, the representatives of the mediators who were women, as well as the women parliamentarians who were observing the process. They came together outside. We were not per se connected to the mediation effort, though the representative of the UN's special envoy was involved in our work. But those women, by virtue of their collaboration on the margins of the negotiations, went back and worked together on their own. So what they needed was neutral facilitation that helped them identify their common interests and that helped them organize themselves to then insert their shared perspectives back into the negotiations. Now, there was lots they disagreed upon. I'm not saying they came back and said, well, we could just make peace on our own. But there were a lot of things they did agree upon. They agreed that civil society women should be formal observers, and so they went back and they achieved that. They agreed that there needed to be more women on the negotiating teams because there had been one on the LRA team. They went back and got a second. They agreed that the protocols for DDR needed to be strengthened to increase the focus on economic and social issues and the investments in healthcare and education for former combatants. Otherwise, there wasn't going to be firm reintegration of those combatants back into their communities, and they inserted those provisions into the agreement. They agreed that sexual violence needed to be outlawed as part of that protocol for the ceasefire, and they went back and did that together. So they had lots that they disagreed with, but they also had lots that they agreed on and that they were willing to go back to the negotiations and work on across conflict lines to insert in those protocols so that they were more meaningful. And I will add that while the peace agreement with the Lord's Resistance Army hasn't been signed, violence has not returned, and the women have continued to work together to push for inclusiveness and transparency in the development of the reconstruction plan for northern Uganda. So actually, even in the absence of a signed peace accord, what you see is a push for participation and inclusiveness. You see civil society and government working together, these women in civil society and in the parliament working and advocating together. And you see a greater likelihood of a solid poverty reduction and development program moving forward in the longer term. So I will stop there. The Uganda, I should have mentioned, the Uganda case study is outlined in here. And look forward to the conversation. But I think there's a lot to be offered and a lot to be mined in these examples that builds on the research, the very important research that's been done. And in the absence of the political will to bring these players to the table, and I'll parenthetically say that UNIFEM just put out research saying that less than 4% of the signatories, 4% of the signatories to peace agreements are women. So there is a lack of political will to bring these people to the table. There is nonetheless an enormous amount that you can do to bring their voices to the table and achieve many of the positive outcomes that you would want to achieve by bringing these voices in as part of negotiating teams. Thank you.
Thank you. I've never quite experienced such disciplined and organized presenters. 15 minutes.
Is that good or bad?
I think it's good.
Bad precedent, though.
Yes. We won't experiment with the latter, with the other alternative. So let's open it up. I know there might be some. There's a little bit of cross conversation going on here already. But since it's 3, let's bring in the audience at this point. We can always kind of go back. Okay, so if you could stand up, take a microphone, and give your name and your basic affiliation, please. First, the lady in the back.
Hi, my name's Sharon Fon, and I work in public health in South Africa. And the last part was really inspiring because when I was listening to the first 2 speakers, the question that I had was one of representation and who comes to the table. And it seems to me that part of what informs that is how you analyze the causes of the conflict. And so, for example, if you define it as an ethnic conflict, I think you land up in a difficult position of looking for demographic representation at the table. But it seems to me that the kind of representation that might be helpful are the people who don't define themselves as Tutsi or Hutu, but the people who define themselves as Burundians, or in the Israel-Palestine issue, the people who don't define themselves as on one side or the other. And how do you get those people to the table if you are defining it as an ethnic conflict? The same in Rwanda, even Kenya. And while I was listening to them, I was saying, and what's interesting is where we've seen people rise above that, they've been women. In Kenya, in Somalia, and I didn't know about all these other cases. And that was my one question is, has anyone looked at where women are involved and the impact of that? But even in the other cases, there must be other groups besides women. And it seems to me that some of it has to do with how you understand the cause of the conflict. And that looking at it as an ethnic conflict is, I think, a superficial and summary way of understanding something, because something causes that in the first place. And often, I mean, wars are generally around resources. And if one understands it in terms of resources rather than in terms of identity politics around I'm a this or a that, does that take us further? Is it easy to do? And does that then define additional groups that you can then bring to the table that are different from someone who is representing a particular armed group or a particular interest group that is based on identity?
We're going to collect a few questions. I believe the lady in red.
Hi, my name is Kim Weichel. I'm with the Institute for Peacebuilding. A question and a comment. Firstly, a question to Anthony. You talked about the benefits and dangers of inclusion and secrecy. So I was wondering if you have any guidelines for how to enhance the benefits of inclusion and at the same time to reduce the dangers you described. Both Elizabeth and Carla mentioned a number of them, but I'd be interested in your guidelines to enhance more inclusivity. And the comment is really to back up everything Carla has said. From my own experience and research, it's engaging women is way beyond an equity issue. It's women are often the ones involved in the community. They're the ones with the fingers in the pulse of what's really going on in the community. So to engage women is really an important part of a sustainable peace.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, this gentleman, and then this gentleman.
Hi, I'm Matthew Lackenbach with the Middle East Peace Civic Forum. Frequently we see that civil society groups are fragmented and not well organized, oftentimes small groups that kind of do their own thing and don't really work well together, or they just don't happen to have those relationships established. Can you talk about the process whereby the small groups come together in an alliance and work together, and how best to organize civil society so that it can have the kind of strength and breadth that would make it effective at a negotiating table?
One more here, and then we'll open it up.
Thank you. Sorry. Amin, Search for Common Ground. I have a question about diaspora groups and including them in peace processes, and where do they really fit in your general analysis of this issue, actually? Thanks.
Okay, let's open it up to the panel for the moment. I'm not quite sure whether the South Africa question was, did you aim it at somebody in particular? Okay. Who would like to, since that's not clear, who would like to respond? Anybody would like to respond to that? Carla?
Sure, I can.
Yeah.
First, I would recount an anecdote that came to me when you were speaking, because I think that I remember when we started bringing Iraqi women in 2003, and I would say that everybody is guilty of this, but I remember with regard to the Iraqi women, it was very important to bring Sunni, Shia, Kurd, Chaldean, Turkmen, every slice. And it became, whenever we went around to these meetings, and these were meetings with people like President Bush, or at the time Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz, or the World Bank, they wanted everybody to identify themselves by their something. Either ethnicity, part of the country, try to divine what they were representing. And the women got increasingly irritated until they finally refused. Because they viewed themselves as Iraqi and had been Iraqis for a long time, and felt that to some extent we were putting them in these boxes. Now, 2003 is a long time ago. And so I don't know if you ask those women today what they would say. But I do at times worry that we tend to try to create neat boxes that exacerbate tensions that might not otherwise have been the source of the conflict. So I agree with you. I think there's a really important need to try to divide things in different ways that don't exacerbate those divides, that don't highlight those divides, and to bring some of those other voices in. I mean, I think if you looked at the Guatemala example, it speaks to these 11 different groups that were basically by field, so academics or media or non-governmental organizations, development service providers, or they sliced different ways. I think one of the common other divisions, in addition to women, are youth, for example, as an area that to be brought into those conversations. So I would say there certainly should be other ways we divide up these interest groups, and we do for things like the needs assessment. So after a peace agreement has been signed, then we say, okay, what are the pillars? Who works in the security sector, in the health sector? We remix, we reshuffle the deck and divide people in different ways. So I think that certainly has some potential, and I would add that I think we do sometimes reassert these kinds of ethnic divisions where perhaps they're not as fundamental to the causes of conflict.
Just a short comment. I think it also depends. I think it depends on the level of demonization that's already happened. I think in the example I gave, at that point there really was, because of the massacres that had happened and the number of Hutu who had left the country, there were very few educated Hutu that could stand up and feel confident about representing anyone, even themselves as individuals. So I think that's part of what the root there. And I would agree that I think we do have to be careful about putting people in boxes and labeling them in such a way that either replicates the conflict dynamics or simply limits creativity as we think about the implementation process. I'm happy to say that now, I think, for example, in Burundi, if you think about the link between the peace negotiation process and the implementation process, there's many more cross-cutting organizations, and people certainly don't identify simply by ethnicity any longer. It's a very different feel now, which is a step in the right direction. And now I would say you'd want to be exploiting those cross-cutting groups much more effectively to prevent a return to violence.
I guess I would just add that I think that identity is one of those conflict motivators that is not very fixed. It is very, very malleable. Our identities in different parts of the world can be stronger or weaker at different times. In our own personal lives, one may change one's identity or alter it or modify it over time. I certainly have experienced that in my own life. I am an immigrant to this country, and my identity has changed over time as I discovered more of where I came from and became more comfortable with where I am. I think it's also connected to how people frame a conflict. Your question was also relevant to the folks who speak in a leadership capacity to their populations. To the extent they frame conflict as an us versus them, zero-sum, we must take everything because otherwise they will leave us nothing. Then they are, of course, enforcing and making more rigid conflict-laden identities. And those are stronger and weaker in different places in the world, but I think that they are malleable. They can be made worse, certainly, and more conflict-prone. I think the opposite is also true, but not a lot of work is invested in it. In many conflicts in the world, we see a great deal of easy mobilization of people in favor of violence, either as passive bystanders or active participants. But we don't see a lot of leaders saying to their populations, these people who we told you were the enemy, it turns out that they are us, and we now need to live with each other. That doesn't happen a lot. On the contrary, people continue to blame mistakes in the process of peace building on the other side and taking credit for advances. So for me, there is a lesson to be learned that's connected. It's another discussion, not our discussion today, but it's a connected discussion of how we promote and socialize ideas like peace to a population that has been mobilized to take on an identity that is very, very in favor of conflict. So I'll leave it with that.
Do you want to go on to, I believe it's Kim, her question about how to enhance inclusive.
How to reduce some of the disadvantages, enhance the advantages, I think it was, for the lady in red.
Yes, the lady.
Thank you. Guidelines. I do have some rough ideas about this. As I said, I came to this, with a deep and abiding fascination with secrecy. I think there is some advantage to it at different moments, and I am truly convinced that people who are empowered to negotiate will do some very bad things when they are negotiating under a microscope, or under the, if you will, the scrutiny of people who can have a say over their physical well-being or their political well-being. And that doesn't mean that they're necessarily in the room, just may mean that they know what's going on. So there is some sense in protecting the intimacy of negotiation at certain points, because otherwise people will not explore difficult discussions that they need to have with their counterparts, with their enemies, if you will. That cannot last too long, however, before it has to give way to a much broader and probably snowballing inclusive process. I mean, these are very immature ideas, but I think that if you, to the extent you need secrecy, you need it early on or at very delicate and sensitive points at which a potentially explosive concession is, or trade-off is explored. But after that, and before that, and during that, you need to be persuading people that it may be discussed. So perhaps, either the snowballing inclusivity or parallel inclusivity with delicate and protected explorations to the extent that they're needed. I think that helps to reduce leaders' uncertainties. There are other reasons why people need to pursue talks quietly. When they have failed to recognize each other, but still need to talk. When they refuse to give each other legitimacy or standing, but still have to deal with practicalities on the ground, they may need to simply talk quietly for a time. But as I say, you need to quickly dispel that and start moving towards letting people know if you haven't done so already. So those are some of the thoughts I have on how you sequence this, perhaps, how you use different aspects of this to your advantage, or rather to the advantage of a more sustainable peace.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah, sure.
Just one thought occurs to me as Anthony is speaking it. I think the international community could do more to support processes that might emerge, local processes in countries in conflict. And the example that comes to mind is Burundi, where there was an internal partnership that started happening even while President Buyoya was being demonized by the international community for having conducted a coup d'etat, and then he actually executed 6 people involved in the violence that happened after the killing of the first democratically elected president. So he chose a moment to appease his hardline constituents by having these people put on trial and then executed. And that left a very negative impression with the international community, as you can imagine, and all this built up a very negative perception of him, which in some ways was quite deserved. On the other hand, there was work that was happening internally in which he actually was participating, where the parliament had they worked very hard to develop what they called this internal partnership to begin to get certain parties on board to get the peace process going again. But the demonization of Buyoya as this person who was impossible to work with actually retarded the support that the international community might have given to that internal partnership as it was beginning to happen. So they were actually trying for a more inclusive process, and the international community didn't recognize it right away. So maybe just another guideline that occurs to me is to be a bit more sensitive as to what's happening internally, such that in cases where it's merited, you could support more inclusive processes.
There was a question, again, I think this was for anyone, about how to foster small groups coming together.
Yeah, organizing the civil society.
Anthony, why don't you
Sure.
start with that one?
Darren should answer that question.
Yeah, Darren.
Or-
Darren, raise your hand. Introduce yourself.
Should you answer that question, Darren?
Where'd Darren go?
He's right there.
Oh,
Darren Q is my colleague and my friend with whom I've been exploring the issue of civil society and peace for a long time. Maybe you can
Quite
participate in the discussion with us. I'll start by saying you deal with fragmentation, one, by recognizing that societal conflicts internally can be just as divisive and potentially as violent as ones across the table with the counterpart, whoever the counterpart is. And that the only solution to it is confronting that and doing something proactively about it. And that could be any number of things, but that could entail policy decisions to put resources behind some consensus building exercises to the extent there is an identifiable structure of parties, of leaders who have standing and who are not averse to being in the same room with each other. That this is a challenge and it's problematic, but let's expand the discussion a little bit.
go ahead.
Thank you. I mean, just to add quickly, one additional point from the research we did that might be applicable was that we found a strong correlation between the democratic structure of the parties themselves and the relationship between the outcome and the peace. So we found, for instance, that this difficult choice of to what extent you exclude civil society very much turned on how democratic were the track one parties themselves. If they were more accountable parties, like in the South African peace process, for instance, then you could safely have less civil society groups at the table because they were still being included in the normal democratic process through lobbying and so on. Whereas in other peace processes, where if you had the typical sort of warlords peace, then you excluded civil society at your peril. In terms of organizing civil society, Anthony mentioned the parallel processes, but also we found that in terms of who to exclude, or sort of who to include, some of the larger democratic civil society groups also provided sort of more bang for your buck. So the international community seems to have this default reach out to the NGO community, which tends to sort of assemble the Lilliputians at the exclusion of some of the bigger civil society groups, the trade unions, the religious institutions, who are more difficult to work with. But if you bring them, they bring a tremendous amount of leadership behind them. They bring a larger constituency with them, and they also bring an organizational capacity around which the smaller groups can then organize themselves. So the trade unions, for instance, often will provide a platform for organizing the NGOs and other organizations out there. So turning towards some of the bigger aspects of civil society that we tend to ignore in these processes might address that to some degree.
Can I, Michael? Can I just, on a more sort of micro level, I mean, I think that first you need to make sure that whoever is sort of facilitating or mediating that conversation is perceived to be neutral and representative of all of the interest in the room, because that ground, creating that foundation for that neutral dialogue is really important. I think the second is enabling the people who are representing these different interest groups to meet as individuals, because then they're able to get in a place where they can agree. I mean, recognizing, as Anthony said, that these folks are in a conflict and they're just as much in a conflict as the people in the negotiations is really important. The third is, I think, very important to help them build an agenda, a constructive agenda, because that enables them to work to find positive space and the things that they all can agree on, that they can then bring feedback into those conversations. And then I think the fourth is helping them understand what it means to advocate for that agenda and how they can then flow back into the negotiating process, because a lot of them, some of them will be natural advocates because that's part of what they do. Some of them will not be natural advocates at all. And so if you're going to make an attempt to level the playing field so that everybody feels like they have a voice within an inclusive process, you need to create the space for people to feel like they all have ownership of each piece of that process. And the yellow publication outside does speak to the sort of how-to nuts and bolts. The other one does not. The other one's more reflective research.
Right, we have one
Michael,
more.
can I add just one point there? On this issue, in my own experience, I think it should be added here the desirability of doing just what you suggest, of not just creating civil society coalitions, if you will, for effectiveness, to give them a broader voice, but also from the perspective of the Track 1 negotiation process. And this is sort of what Darren was referring to in the South African situation, because you have limited space at the table, because that's going to be demanded by the process, unfortunately, that having representative groups is absolutely essential. And so there's a desirability to go about doing the kind of organizational work you're talking about. It's not just a good thing to do for effectiveness, but to contribute to the process.
All right, good. I'm glad to see some more hands coming up. We've got one more from the first batch, though. Amin's question about diaspora. Who would like to address that?
I'll just say quickly, because I know Amin, that
So do I.
that diaspora groups are probably very neglected by parties themselves, partly because they tend to be more militant than people living in the conflict itself in many cases. The stakes are lower for them. It's easier to be a Monday morning quarterback and tell everybody what they should be doing in the most extreme terms possible. That said, I think more should be done about diaspora groups from the perspective of both civil society leaders in the conflict and elites at the negotiation table. You cannot really count on them coming along without some sustained engagement, and it will be risky. It would probably be, all kinds of things, from town hall meetings abroad to some sort of targeted communication and opinion expressions of op-eds, perhaps. All kinds of ways to communicate with that community and maybe make it a two-way conversation.
We've always brought in folks from the diaspora whenever we're working, because we think that it's very important, potentially critical source of financial and technical assistance to the process, and also often the folks in the diaspora have enormous networks of their own that get to people who are involved in the table. And since we're fundamentally talking about an advocacy process, having those linkages are really important. That having been said, obviously, and I think particularly as Reconstruction progresses, the tensions arise even beyond the issue of the political tensions of the positions of diaspora communities vis-a-vis negotiations, because you see in places like Liberia the challenges of bringing in folks who have been living, those who have left and those who stayed, and what tensions that produces. But I think the earlier you start bringing those people in and creating those relationships between those who are in country and those who are in the diaspora, the more you can blunt some of the tensions that do arise, because you are once again creating a sense of community, and particularly if you're crossing over boxes, so you're crossing the ethnicity box or the areas of specialization box, and you're starting to build the connections. Then I think the sooner you bring those voices to bear and bring them together, the more you can quiet some of the longer term challenges.
I'd failed to get an order of this melee now that we've got questions, so I'm going to sort of go from here up there arbitrarily. Yes, sir. Sorry.
I'm going to take a bunch of them together.
Yeah, we'll take a few together.
Okay, Dave Rabinowitz, private citizen. Today, independent actors, often single individuals, are able to totally disrupt negotiations through terrorism, assassination, various sorts of incitement. Are there any ways to handle that?
All right. Yes, ma'am. Mademoiselle. Here in front. Well, front row. Kim.
I'm interested in exploring a little bit further the issue of youth being included in these processes. It came up just briefly with Carla mentioning it. And I'm interested in a couple of angles that have come up, one of which, going back to what Liz said about implementation. So it strikes me that it's one of the largest groups left in a society that is dealing with conflict or post-conflict, and would be... it would be beneficial then to have them be included for implementation, going toward implementation. And another is that perhaps they're one of the best groups to look at more cross-conflict parties. So Carla mentioned the women in Northern Ireland being the only cross-conflict party at the table. it strikes me that some civil society groups that deal with youth might lend themselves to cross-conflict parties being included at the table. So I wonder if people could just comment on experience with youth being included or not being included. They certainly seem like an easy group to dismiss, and that seems problematic. But they also seem like possibly one of the most creative groups. And again, going back to Carla mentioning things that more people being included at the table allow a process to look at that might be forgotten otherwise. It seems like youth would be important in that respect as well.
Kim?
Thank you. Kim Malin Clark from ACOM International Development. I've just spent the past 2 years in Senegal leading a project to try to facilitate civil society involvement in the peace process there. And I liken it a lot to herding cats. There's a lot of different interests. A lot of them are competing with each other. They're competing for access to resources, position, status. There's a lot of reasons why they're trying to get a seat at the table, and very few of them are altruistic. Nonetheless, I would say that it's important to look at all the different interests that are there within civil society and to try to get them to see the interest in working together to try to advance the peace process. In general, I think they do have an interest in seeing it advance. They just don't necessarily have an interest in working with someone, working with others, and it's necessary to work at different layers with elites as well as village elders. I've seen women's groups cut into each other. I mean, the competition among women's groups can be very, very fierce. I'm interested in hearing then from your perspectives is where does this trade-off between efficiency and legitimacy lie? I mean, how do you make it, where do you find the balance?
Why don't we take those for now?
Okay.
On spoilers, terrorists, so on.
I've got some thoughts.
Okay.
You are right. Peace processes are fragile negotiations because they often involve some point of negotiation over when the parties will actually stop fighting. And that moment in time, in my research, is particularly dangerous because it empowers the lowest ranking combatants or even people who are not actively part of the fight to upset things. In my work with my own students, I ask them, who can upset a ceasefire? And they name all these big organizations and things, but it's really anybody with a gun or a grenade or access to explosives that can upset a ceasefire. So what I think needs to be done is that when people design a peace process, that there be some consensus that negotiations won't stop for an act that is otherwise abhorrent and appalling, unless it is directly caused by the people across the table, which is what often is discussed. They then engage in the narrative of blame rather than understanding that it is possibly isolated elements on the other side, not under the direct line of command, who engage in this. Now, sometimes there are strategies where a leader will say, well, let some of our more extreme people do what they do, and that'll apply some pressure on it. And that is a very short-sighted and backfiring strategy. But if there is a prior consensus that negotiations will continue, I think that reduces some of the motivation to engage in that strategy, whether it's directed or non-directed in the first place.
Okay. Youth? Carla, do you want to start?
Sure. I think that it's really critically important to do a better job within the international community to bring in youth, in addition to the reasons you mentioned, also because they're often important spoilers. And so having them feel ownership of the process and that they've been involved in it is important. I will say, though, my limited knowledge on issues of bringing in youth, I would say that certainly some of the models that we've used for bringing their voices to the fore, I think could be applied from women or from civil society groups to young people. But they are a harder group also to organize in some ways because their status is changing, their positions are changing within society. And the example I would draw on is in Rwanda, where the women have organized very, very successfully over the post-conflict period to rise in governance. And in fact, in Rwanda is the only majority female parliament now in the world. The youth had set aside seats as well. So there were seats for youth, there were seats for women, and the youth haven't managed to translate that into the kind of sustained voice that the women have been able to do. And I think that we haven't studied that, but I think it would be very interesting to see what the difference was between the structures that were created that started out, some of them being identical structures, and why have they had an enduring impact for women and they have not had that same enduring impact for young people.
I think there's someone in the room who could probably answer this question better than I. I'll say something, and Mark, if you want to say something, you should please feel free. I would say that it's critical to think about youth and not simply sort of as a demographic, because youth, particularly, for example, on the continent of Africa, are the majority of combatants. So you're not just talking about, a few people we ought to consider integrating into our thinking about the implementation of the peace accords. You're talking about entire DDR processes, the security sector reform. You're talking about one of the number one issues is employment in terms of implementation of peace accords. That addresses youth and what are the educational structures in a country and how are we preparing for the future of a post-conflict state. So I think we need to consider much more carefully than we have in the past who are these young people and how do we want to include them. And interestingly, Carla brings up the case of Rwanda, and one of the things that Mark and I have discovered in our research there is, yes, women have been quite effective. And when people talk about youth, they often talk about young men. But young women's voices are left virtually out of every discussion and equation. They don't have the status amongst women's groups to come to the table, or even if they come, they don't get recognized. And amongst youth organizations, it tends to be that we're talking about young men. We're not. And women also, young women get excluded in there as well. So I don't have any answers for you, Becca, but I do think that this is something that merits a lot more research and thinking as we consider what our strategies are in a post-conflict state. I don't know, Mark, if you want to make any more comments.
Introduce yourself, please.
Okay.
Not to put you on the spot or anything.
I'm Mark Summers at USIP. I think there's a difference between, you're talking sort of in a discrete way, time-wise, about negotiating peace negotiations. And I think in that case, it's pretty important in most places to think about including some of these very frustrated, very angry, educated young men who are unemployed. With regards to because if you don't do that, you can really create a kind of a situation with spoilers and people who can be taken, whose frustration, they can be manipulated pretty easily. But I think in the broader context, because Carla, for example, was talking about this sort of the peace building and the implementation was mentioned, to assume that they represent very many youth in the country is a big mistake in my experience. Most youth are poorly educated in many of these war-affected countries, and class-wise, there's such a difference. They often despise each other, and so to assume that these young, educated men represent very many people, again, I think is a big mistake. And in terms of implementation, when you listen to that group, you have to be careful about who they represent, because it's a small proportion of the population, but in another way, it's one you have to pay attention to. And I think it's also unwise to not pay attention to these young men because they're so connected usually to, as Liz pointed out, to fighting groups in some one way or the other. And I just want to strengthen what Liz said. The rule of thumb with women's groups is that it's middle-aged women. The rule of thumb for youth groups is that it's elite young men. So to assume that young women are represented in either of those is a big mistake. But again, in terms of security and getting to a peace accord, it's usually not. They usually don't play much of a role. But in terms of implementation afterwards, they sure do. So.
All right. The next question was the herding cats question. Thank you for that apt phrase, so we can remember it so easily. How do you bring in people who are interested in some level of the problem of interest, altruistically or really in some other way, who are going to be productive for the process, who have a certain amount of legitimacy but also efficacy?
Sure.
I'm sure there's answers here.
I know nothing about the Senegal peace process or what you've been engaged in, so I can't speak with any authority to that. But I think this issue of the trade-off, I don't know if I would call it efficiency and legitimacy, but what you're talking about in terms of that is really the crux of the issue. And at some point, I mean, what I would say is there's a spectrum from what we have in most cases now, which is either completely secretive, closed negotiations that often there's some kind of a press effort to get out information, but there's really very little participation by anyone other than belligerents, all the way to I'm not saying that this is Senegal, but all the way to something which would be a completely unlimited process that brings in anyone who wants a voice and allows them space. And I guess what I would say is that you choose your point on the spectrum, and it gets back to this question of what kind of structure can you put in place, and it can be a structure that allows one interest group or two interest groups. It can be a structure that allows 11 interest groups or 15 interest groups, and it can give them some kind of a direct voice or indirect voice. But that in terms of that spectrum, you need to pick your location based on some of the things that Anthony was mentioning earlier in terms of when you need secret. And the other thing I would say is I think it also needs to be keyed to the timing within the negotiating process and the issue that you're discussing in that process. So for certain issues, your trade-off will tilt towards efficiency, and for certain issues, it will tilt towards legitimacy and greater inclusion. And that at the end of the day, I mean, to go back to your earlier question in terms of practice, I think that keying things to the structure, the agenda for negotiations, can be a helpful way to try and figure out what you want at a different stage, because you can make those choices. If you want to have a more refined way of thinking about a negotiation, you can break it into pieces. So if this is power sharing discussion, who do I need to have involved? If this is wealth sharing, who do I need to have involved? If this is DDR, who do I need to have involved in the process? And it can be a different trade-off that you choose for different points in time and different stages in that conversation.
All right, going up the rows.
Can I just say one thing, Michael?
Sorry, go ahead,
I
Liz. Yeah.
Very quickly, I think the other question that we have to ask ourselves too as interveners from the international community is, are we putting an artificial timeline on this? Because I think it takes time to build legitimacy of any process, and I think I don't also know anything really about the conflict in the Casamance in Senegal, but I think this is what we've discovered all over the world, which is, okay, we have 2 years worth of funding, therefore the peace process will take 2 years. And that's completely unrealistic, as we all know, yet we still are driven by these timelines that are either imposed by donors or imposed by governments. And legitimacy comes over time often, and then some of the groups weed themselves out and others emerge as being more representative and gain more legitimacy as the process moves forward. So I think this issue of time is very, very important.
Are there still questions in this group left after this fuller discussion? I guess there is.
Which one first? This one was...
I'm sort of going arbitrarily. I've lost track of this lady in the white.
Okay.
My name is Arnila. I'm with American University. I'm a grad student there in the Peace and Conflict program. And I actually spent the last 2 months doing my thesis research on the inclusion of civil society in the Congolese peace process. And I was in Eastern DRC. And one of the things I found is that, as Elizabeth has mentioned, civil society is defined slightly differently there. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little more about, are there legitimate ways to redefine civil society, and then how does that affect ways that they are included within the peace process?
Could you just add, what do you mean by it being defined differently in Eastern DRC?
Tell us a little about your exciting research and findings. Go ahead.
Well, essentially, one of the things I found was that in Eastern DRC, there is actually a very official structure, associational group that defines themselves as civil society. So they call themselves civil society in Eastern DRC. And this is the group that is often included in the peace process. But the question is whether they are actually really connected to the population. And it's not exactly, I think, in Western conceptualizations, civil society is often these very voluntary groups, whereas this group within Eastern DRC is a very official structure. So it's a little bit different. So that's what I mean.
Locally official, anyway. Yeah.
Right.
All right. Moving up the row, we neglect. There we go.
Thank you. My name is Aida Isakovic. I work at AD for Center for Civil Society and Governance, and I have a quick question. Actually, Elizabeth, you addressed two very big concerns of mine. One is what I'm just tying to that question, who is civil society? And in my work, I have seen civil society being really driven by political groups, which work for the leaders by really different reasons to form a civil society. And also from very beginning, after the post-conflict, there are funds that really pour into the country. And the nature of those even civil society changes over time. And it becomes more like a survival, employee, salary concern, and they lose the focus sometimes of what their really goal and spark was to begin with. And so one of my question is how to keep the civil society's focus. And the second question is definitely, I have seen in my field, a lot of money is bypassing government, and they are really divorced from each other. So how can we marry really government and civil societies? At this point, I have seen in many countries that really government does not care about either voices of a small civil society, be that youth or other organization-wise. So I don't know, do you have any ideas for my own field, but I would love to hear it. Thank you.
How about one more? Any more? I think these people were slightly ahead of you, so I'm going to impose my authority here.
Hi, my name is Megan Chapman with the Public International Law and Policy Group, and I'm wondering if any of the panelists could speak to the role that the active role that that civil society groups may play in helping to bring the various actors in peace negotiation to the table prior to them actually coming. Because up till now, this discussion has sort of focused on the inclusion, the choice to include or not include civil society groups in the peace negotiation. And I guess I'm thinking specifically about the example of the women's movement in Liberia as an active player in bringing the parties to the table.
All right, let's tackle those three, somewhat related.
Okay.
Liz, go ahead.
Well, and Anthony and Carla, please feel free to jump in. I'm not sure I can answer. I'll put the two together, the two questions. I think what happens in DRC, in Congo, is not atypical. I think there are many countries in which there is a structure for civil society, and it refers to a certain type of organization. I think what we need to be aware of is that as we come from, particularly as we come from, many of us come from the West, and we think about our own values and how then those values manifest themselves in our identification of who is civil society and who's not civil society, and therefore that must influence our choice of who we think should participate in the process, therefore who we give resources to. And then how those organizations should conduct themselves. Now, as the research that Anthony and Darren have done, it does reflect that, if I understood it correctly, that also those civil society organizations that had more democratic internal structures also seem to inform the values that were discussed at the table, if I understood that correctly. And that's important, and I think we have to be careful about imposing a value structure on civil society and on peace processes. Certainly we want the violence to end, but whatever the governance structure is that results from that, I think as interveners, it is a question that we need to ask ourselves. Are we willing to impose our value set? And I think that relates to both of these questions in the sense that that's where money goes, both during the peace negotiations and afterwards. And certainly I've seen in Burundi there's a tendency for an RFP. So, right, an RFP goes out and a local NGO will adapt itself. Oh, you want election monitoring? We can do election monitoring. Last week we were doing, civil society building, but this week we'll do election monitoring. Then next week we'll do sort of evaluation. And that is not actually such a criticism of the organizations. It really is, if we think about the root of many of these conflicts, it's access to resources. Who has the right to an education, which then leads to your ability to get a job? Many of those, there's a big gap. You're either in the elite and you're working for internationally funded organizations or the government, or you're a farmer. I mean, there's very little middle ground in many of these countries that are affected by war. So it isn't a surprise that organizations are quickly sort of changing their hats to respond to whatever the international donor is bringing to the table as a set of resources and in terms of reference. So I think we need to be very careful then about how we both define civil society and then what we're asking these organizations to do after the fact. And I don't know if I think we need to be more inclusive, frankly, in DRC. I think there are many other organizations that are doing some really good work that don't necessarily correspond to that particular associational structure. I am not as familiar with DRC. I know something about it, but I'm not sure I have any great strategies to suggest on how you might go about including those organizations. And yes, we need to be aware of where and how we fund these organizations because it does affect change and the implementation process within a given society. To answer the second part of your question about how to not bypass government, I think one institution to look towards is DFID, so the British government. They have really been quite explicit in how they're thinking about where their money goes. And they do a lot of funding of the public sector. And the reason for that is they've discovered that in post-conflict states, only funding those organizations and institutions outside of government doesn't necessarily help the peace process. Because just because you have a very strong civil society does not mean you'll necessarily then have a very strong government. And the two need to work in concert. You can't really have one without the other. That's a recipe, I think, for disaster. So I think looking to the practices of DFID and some of the principles on which they operate would be important for many, many different donors. But I'm not quite sure how to marry the two, other than to be aware of that.
All right, we had a question about, actually I'm afraid my mind was straying. I apologize.
Sort of track two efforts to get people to the table.
Okay, thank you. Anyone?
Liberia? Was that the one?
Yes.
Yeah.
You want to take that?
No, I'm taking all the questions. Do you want to take
Yeah.
them?
Sure.
We all can take them.
One thing on what Elizabeth was saying, I think in terms of the definition of civil society, never believe someone who declares themselves to be the representative of anybody.
Well said.
And, a lot of the effort we put in when we're working to convene groups is very, very extensive research, going out to people who work in different sectors and people who work on different topics and people who work with different ethnic groups in different parts of the country from different viewpoints, whether it's formal governments, aid donors, mediators, and those groups, to see where you start to see people emerge as leaders who are points of reference for a wide variety of different individuals. And so I think that's really important, is not to take people's word for it. And in fact, even in formal negotiations, we sometimes get in trouble because we take people's word for it when they say, oh, we are representative of a large group of somebody, and therefore we need a seat at the table. On the issue of Liberia, I think 2 points I would say. One is there was the Liberian women, and if you're talking about the story, which is beautifully documented in Pray the Devil Back to Hell, the Liberian women were extraordinary in their mobilization to bring to a successful conclusion the negotiations for peace in Liberia. They did have some institutional support related to the Mano River Women's Union, and which had been active in working on bringing peace to bear. They also did form alliances with some of the women at the table. So when I met with some of the women who were actually at the table in the negotiations, there's a famous scene in this film where they lock the negotiators in the room and refuse to let them out because they're so fed up with how they're not negotiating seriously. Well, when I met with the women who were involved in the negotiations, said, oh, we knew that was happening. We left. We were long gone. We were told in advance that that was happening, and we weren't in the room. So there were some of these alliances set up so that they could get intelligence back from the folks who were sitting at the table and knew what was happening in there. And that was, I think, actually fed their anger because they saw the obfuscation that was taking place in those conversations. Critically important is the preparation before these folks get to the table because it enables them really to think about what their agenda might be, what their priorities are, and how to enunciate that from a position of strength. There are a myriad of examples of people who got there and didn't know how to leverage the power and authority they have. One example we talk about in Guatemala, Luz Mendez was the only woman on the movement team, URNG, in Guatemala. She, in the midst of the negotiations, went to Beijing, and that was really where she became sensitive to issues of gender, because of course you can't assume that because it's a woman this person is paying any attention to issues related to women's priorities or to gender. But she went to Beijing, she came back, she said, it was really for me a light bulb moment. It was a moment when I realized that I had a role that was larger than just representing my movement, that I was also the only one there representing women. And that kind of orientation, on the opposite side, Aloysia Nyumba, who's an icon of the rebuilding of Rwanda, currently a senator. But she said, I went to these negotiations. I think I was the only woman, and I don't think I peeped. And I didn't know how to leverage that power. And this is an extraordinarily powerful woman. So we're not talking about a shrinking violet. We're talking about somebody who's one of the key people who brought the country back from post-genocide, and yet she needed that kind of training. So really, really important. The last thing I would say that's also interesting is if you look at Liberian women leaders in civil society, it's the different pieces of civil society are most adept at different stages in that process. And one of the things that's been very interesting to work with the women in Liberian civil society to move to a more a role of constructive engagement with the government. They were overwhelmingly successful at agitating for successful conclusion to negotiations. They mobilized en masse in ways that were extraordinary, both for the negotiating process to bring the negotiations to a successful close, and also to get Ellen Johnson Sirleaf elected. And those two mass mobilization efforts were tremendous. Very hard to move, to shift from doing that kind of work to then saying, okay, now we have a friend in office, and we need to engage in ways that help her move an agenda forward. And how do we advocate in ways that are constructive? How do we propose rather than just oppose? And that's been something they have worked extremely hard on learning to pivot. Given a changing environment. So when you talk about civil society's roles, I think there's an important lesson there about which pieces of civil society and for which roles. And different groups play different roles at different times.
Let me add an observation to that bears on the Liberian experience and the example that was just stated, and that is a apparently fairly unpublic role of an organization called the Association of Female Lawyers of Liberia, AFEL, which through the transition 2004-2006 and through recent years, but particularly during those years, was very successful in negotiating a change in all of the inheritance laws and land ownership laws as they affected women in Liberia. Remarkable success there. Doing it very much on the quiet, very much in the background, but a very powerfully oriented group of women who had a remarkable success, which I'm surprised is not better known in the world as a real role model.
Anthony has a comment on that question, and then I think we'll probably wrap it up at that point.
Last thing I'd like to say is about what I think is the existence of layers of civil society. We have sort of spoken about civil society in a monolithic way today. And early on, some of you mentioned the definitional problems here. My own students in their research are looking at the various problematic forms that civil society takes. Darren and I have spoken about uncivil society. The fact that people, in the morning could be running their PTA and the evening could be running guns. There are other layers, I think, worth exploring and acknowledging, including the existence of indigenous people, of clan structures, of organizations, practices, customs, norms that pre-exist the state, that have played some role in the advancement of culture in a particular place, and that may have paid a price in modern warfare, but that may continue in some distorted way to exist and may come back and offer something to their people in a post-conflict setting. So there's a lot to be looked at there in the time I've spent in Guatemala, and it's a place that I think resembles Afghanistan a lot. There are organizations and norms that existed long before there was a country called Guatemala, long before there were people speaking Spanish in the Americas. They suffered a lot during the Civil War. They were neglected in the peace. They have organized themselves to say we need things in the peace to look more like what we want our society to reflect. We cannot then have a peace that continues to exclude us. So looking at what they, since they are essentially the majority of the population, how they want to live, how they want to resolve their disputes, how they want to decide on how justice is administered, is a really critical part of crafting the peace and then living it. So I'll leave it there.
Well, I think we've had a really good discussion that kind of deconstructs, among other things, deconstructs this rather ambiguous and umbrella concept of civil society and begins to sort through some of the issues about what kinds of civil society, what kinds of functions are appropriate at what stages of conflict and under what conditions. The Guatemala and Burundi, quite different, for example, in terms of level of development of the civil society infrastructure and so on. So please join me in thanking our speakers.